In this brief update to Chapter 5, I want to talk about two things. Basically, the opening vignette. As you'll see in that chapter, we talk about the problem of population pressure. And I want to note that there's a conflict of values that appears in this vignette as we're thinking about that. And then I want to briefly touch on the section focused on Mill on race and women. As I mentioned before, and as you know, this is the 10th edition revise of our textbook, and there's a couple of things that have changed in this chapter just to kind of highlight. And the first is that section on the what do you think question focused on population pressure. So this is the opening vignette in that chapter. It's basically points out that there's a conflict here, and it's worth thinking about this as you think about utilitarianism. And of course, as you know, we're throughout this course talking about conflicts of values, so I want you to think carefully about this. The facts of the matter, in italics there, this is facts that we quote in the text. In 2019, the global population exceeded 7.7 billion people. The UN predicts that by 2030, the global population will increase to 8.5 billion, with the population growing close to 10 billion by 2050. I believe by now we've actually exceeded 8 billion people, so we're on our way. So the questions that are asked are those you see below, and again, if we had time in class face-to-face, I'd ask you to turn to a neighbor and discuss these and argue about these. But what I want you to think about here just briefly in this lecture is how do we manage a utilitarian set of concerns when there are other concerns that exist? So think of it this way, and here's, and you'll see this in the chapter, and hopefully you already kind of understand this. Maybe there's just too many people, right? Maybe there's a problem in distributing goods and resources for almost 10 billion people. Utilitarians are interested in those kinds of big questions. How do we manage global population pressures, and how are we going to find food and water and manage the waste and the pollution generated by all of these folks? How are we going to manage social problems and immigration pressures and climate change and all this stuff with this many people? That utilitarian consideration, obviously important. Of course, there are other considerations. On the opposite end of this consideration are like the individual decisions of real people who are choosing to have babies or not. Notice one utilitarian proposal may just simply say we need to limit population, and then it doesn't really matter how we bring that about. So could that include like a license for having children? Could it include violations of people's autonomy, where you basically say, no, you can't have children? In China, you may recall that there was this one-child policy, which basically said families can only have one child. That policy could be justified on a utilitarian, straight-up utilitarian argument. Of course, that policy seems to violate the rights, the autonomy, the liberty of individual decision makers. And so there we go. That's the sort of conflict. You'll see as you think about utilitarianism, from a very abstract level, it's pretty obvious sometimes what the answer is. Like in this case, maybe limit population. On the other hand, once you start digging into the particulars, you end up with these conflicts. Last thought, before we move to the next issue, it could be that autonomy and those other values can be brought into utilitarian concern in a way that's actually productive of the kind of outcomes we want. So just to note that one of the solutions to population pressure has to do with the empowerment of women, giving women autonomy, giving women the right to control their own reproductive lives, providing access to birth control, giving women the right to say no to men and even to their husbands when it comes to sex and reproduction. That emphasis on women's rights and autonomy could have a good utilitarian outcome. Those are the kind of resolutions that utilitarians are going to have to think about. How can we both respect autonomy and liberty and those kind of values while also producing the kinds of outcomes that we might want from a utilitarian perspective? Anyway, moving forward, and since we have the issue of women's autonomy on the table, let me just highlight a section in the chapter. It's called Mill on Race and Women. We added this or kind of expanded this a bit in this chapter, although not a lot. It's a little short here, but so I want to emphasize it. This was I think, an important part of the new revision. Two things. So the first has to do with Mill and his views of women. So Mill, let me back up for a second. As a utilitarian, Mill was interested in promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Yes, we understand that. His view included, among those who deserve to be happy, women. He thought that women also deserved an equal shot at happiness. And he understood, as an empirically minded person who just looked at the world around him and used his senses to measure happiness, he understood that women were often unhappy because they were kept in a state of subjugation or subjection, as he put it. So he actually wrote an essay. He actually co-authored this essay with his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, who worked on this with him. They basically argued that there was important claims to be made for releasing women from their subjection. This included claims about the importance of giving women the right to vote. And Harriet Taylor Mill herself wrote a pamphlet, an influential pamphlet on the women's right to vote. So in short, just emphasize this. Utilitarians have typically been progressive in terms of social issues because if they see unhappiness, they want to fix it. One of the unhappinesses that Mill was aware of had to do with the subjugation of women, and he said that we need to fix that. It's in all of our interests to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, including women. Of course, an interesting second problem, let me skip forward so I have all this on one slide. An interesting second problem has to do with Mill's view of race and colonialism. So you may know that the British Empire had colonized much of the world, including North America, but also in India and in Asia. And Mill was a defender of the British colonial project. So some people find this to be outrageous, and there are folks today who criticize him for his defense of colonialism. So let's understand for a second where he's coming from before we launch into a critique. So Mill tended to think that Western civilization, European civilization, that British life was good, that it was actually good because it promoted happiness, it produced industry, it developed capitalism, it included liberation of women and so on. Mill thought that, he's writing this in the middle of the 19th century, he thought that the British Empire was pretty good and that the goods of that empire should be spread around the world. Now, he doesn't think, therefore, that the British were justified in just brutally exploiting the peoples that they colonized, even though he did work for the British East India Company, who tended to profit off this colonial venture. Notice again, the utilitarian justification of colonialism would say that it's good for those who are being colonized to be colonized by the British, because the British will teach them how to do capitalism, how to develop industry, how to develop political systems that are liberal and democratic, maybe even how to release women from bondage. You can hear this kind of colonial utilitarian argument. The critique of this, on the other hand, suggests that this is just a version of the so-called white man's burden, where the presumption is, the critique says that Europeans are presumptuous to think that they can go in and liberate and enlighten folks who are non-European, that it really is just a masquerade for rapacious colonialism, imperialism, that basically the British are just taking advantage of those that they colonized, and that colonialism is wrong in that regard. Now, again, we can't adjudicate this debate right now. It's been going on for a number of years, and there's actually continued discourse about decolonizing and post-colonial theory and so on. A bunch of really interesting work is being done on this, but a lot of the conversation can be traced back to John Stuart Mill, who did in fact argue on utilitarian grounds that colonialism is good for those on the receiving end of it. Again, now some people may choose to then reject Mill, because if he says this and if you think that it's just wrong-headed, then you may reject Mill in general. Now, pause for a further point. One could reject Mill's colonialism while still accepting his defenses of utilitarianism. These are two separate things. Utilitarianism is the big theory of what's right and what's wrong. Mill says what's right is to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's a separate question of whether, in fact, colonialism is good or justifiable. You understand the point, I hope, that one could criticize colonialism on utilitarian grounds. One could say that colonialism just produces unhappiness for those who are colonized, in which case it would be wrong. Mill did not think that way. He gave a utilitarian justification for colonialism, but so the conversation goes. Again, notice the difference is at the level of principle, maybe the basic principle we accept, produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, but we may disagree about how that applies in a case like colonialism. Okay, last paragraph on this page. Mill was also an opponent of slavery. And in fact, he commented on American slavery in the middle of the 19th century. He basically thought it was horrifying and awful. Now notice how this goes. As a utilitarian, Mill makes a kind of argument that says there's nothing worse. Let's use the word happiness again, that much, much more unhappiness is produced by the slave system than any kind of happiness that could come out on a different kind of calculation on that. So Mill is pretty adamant in his opposition to slavery. He calls it cruelty, tyranny, wanton oppression, and he says he has yet to hear of anything more detestable than this being done on any part of the earth. He basically thinks that it's an awful, terrible thing. Now, again, just the point I made a moment ago, perhaps one could make a utilitarian argument in defense of slavery, but it would be very weird, wouldn't it, to say that the greatest happiness of the greatest number is produced by a system that reduces some people to absolute slavery that involves cruelty, tyranny, and wanton oppression. Mill didn't think it worked out that way. In fact, I can't think of anyone who really would argue on utilitarian grounds that slavery could be justified with this caveat. So notice the calculation of who counts in terms of the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. One of the defenses of slavery was to say that those who were kept in slavery were less than fully human, or maybe that their happiness didn't count. Take this back then to the previous point about the subjection of women. In the 19th century and prior, there were some folks who said that women just didn't count as much, that women's happiness was not to be taken into account. You could imagine people that justify the oppression of women could say, well, women need to be oppressed. It's for their own benefit. And if they're unhappy about it, that's just because they don't understand it or something like that. Something similar could go on with regard to colonization. And I suppose, as I said, a very strange kind of argument could be made about the justification of slavery. So summarize this, the takeaway. Remember, we began this lecture talking about conflicts of values, this brief update talking about conflicts of values. The conflicts may involve conflicts between principles. So do we think that the main principle is the greatest happiness for the greatest number? That's the utilitarian principle. Or is there another principle that counts, like autonomy or liberty? We may be able to find a way to negotiate and bring those two things together, as I mentioned previously with regard to a discussion of population, that the liberation of women may be one way to mitigate the population, the growth of population. And then there's a question in terms of conflicts of values about how we apply our principles to cases, right? So Mill applied his utilitarian reasoning to the liberation of women, saying that women also deserve to be happy. He applied his utilitarian reasoning to the case of slavery, and he said that slavery is obviously wrong because it produces so much unhappiness. But Mill applied his utilitarian reasoning to colonialism slightly differently. He thought that colonialism was actually good for those who were on the receiving end of it, that they would be more happy in the long run. And so it goes. Okay, this brief lecture just to hit some of these topics that we've introduced in the new edition. Hopefully it enriches your understanding of utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill.